I always assumed I was just kidding, making a harmless remark. I told him, joking like it was no big deal, "You're my second choice." But now I'm sitting in my car with the divorce papers in my hand, wondering how in the world this whole thing came to be. This is my tale about how a joke destroyed my marriage. My name is Amanda, and I'm 31 years old. It began with a routine family, children, and 2 children. Our 7-year-old daughter Mia and our 4-year-old son Ethan. You are aware that they are the center of your entire universe. Keeping the house together, birthday celebrations, and school runs. I believe that being a stay-at-home mother was sufficient because I didn't have a job. But I suppose that's where everything started to go wrong. Even though I was unaware of it at the time, I was beginning to take things for granted. My spouse Eric worked hard. After a hard day, he would return home exhausted, and I would unwind, chat about the kids, or gripe about the house. And I simply became resentful of him. He was the one who provided everything. Always there, always doing out his assigned tasks. However, what about me? What about my necessities? I spent the entire day with the children, taking care of everything. I began to feel frustrated since I wasn't receiving any attention. Friday night was one of the few occasions when the children were not present. I had a glass of wine while Eric tried to prepare a wonderful supper for us. I made the remark while we were seated at the table and merely conversing. I can't even recall what preceded it. Perhaps it was because I was worn out from taking care of the kids, or perhaps it was because he had worked so much overtime that week. Like a joke, I just blurted it out. I could have married someone else, you know. My second choice is you. I chuckled. He didn't. Although I could see it in his eyes, I dismissed it. It was just a dumb thing to say. It wasn't foolish, though. It was slicing. The pain behind his eyes was visible to me. However, I didn't pause to consider it. I simply assumed he was being overly sensitive. In retrospect, I realized that was not the case at all. Things between us began to change after that. Minor details. We had never really argued like that before, but it was just little disagreements. I didn't give it much thought. I was in my own universe. Being a mother, taking care of the children, and maintaining order in the home. Eric, however, appeared to be more reserved. Not as much. The late hours followed. He would give me a halting response when I asked him what he had been up to. He claimed that he occasionally went out for drinks with his friends after work. I didn't ask any questions. Perhaps I ought to have, but I didn't. I didn't want to come out as domineering. I also didn't want to come out as a bothersome person. However, I sensed it. Both the distance and my anger were increasing. He was out there working and living his own life, while I spent the entire day by myself with the kids. It began to eat away at me. I didn't give it much thought when I saw one evening that he was texting more. All he was doing was being aloof. However, I suppose I wanted him to return to me, to be the husband I had, the one who paid attention and showed curiosity. I therefore followed the jokes. Do you know? To fill the void, in an attempt to elicit a response. As like I didn't give a damn. In my heart, though, I cared more than I ever showed. When I returned home early one evening after dropping Mia off at her friend's place, everything went haywire. He was on the bed, texting someone on his phone as I entered our bedroom. I initially assumed it was just his friend. Then I noticed the name, though. Katie. My heart fell. Katie? I had never met a Katie. His face became pale when he realized I had been staring at him for a few seconds. I blurted out, "Who the hell is Katie?" because I didn't know what to say. He stopped. Didn't initially say anything. He looked everywhere but at me as his eyes moved. And then he said, "Just a coworker." However, I wasn't comfortable with the manner he expressed it. I held on to it. Really? A colleague? Because it certainly doesn't appear to be. I knew something was wrong because I could see the guilt on his face. However, I wasn't considering his feelings at the moment. Not even our children were on my mind. All I wanted to know was what was happening. He texted her, but why? After our hours-long argument, I was certain he was telling lies to me. I couldn't even see straight because I was so angry. I can't even recall the other things we exchanged. However, I can still recall the sensation of that pit in my stomach. The jealousy, the rage. I continued to push him away, and he reciprocated. I was blind to the growing distance between us until it was too late. Now that I look back, I see how much I pushed him. I am aware that I was not the ideal wife, and I was most certainly not the ideal mother. However, I was upset. I was too proud to acknowledge that I was harmed. Perhaps I could have avoided those jokes. Perhaps I could have avoided acting out and growing angrier if I had simply spoken to him and expressed how I felt. Perhaps if I had been a bit more conscious of myself. However, I am now sitting here with these divorce documents, clinging to what I destroyed. And I keep asking myself if I'll ever get it back. I wonder whether we will ever return to our pre-joke state. However, I doubt that we will. Not with all that has transpired. Do you believe there was anything I could have done differently? Or was this the inevitable conclusion? Everything changed after that night. The tension between us became intolerable as Eric began to stay late more frequently. I recall the lengthy pauses during meals. The way he would conceal things by keeping his phone face down on the table. In an attempt to act as though nothing had happened and that I was okay, I continued to try to fill the room with jokes. But I felt in my heart that we were falling apart. I tried to ignore the mounting uneasiness as the weeks passed. I even convinced myself that I was exaggerating. Perhaps I was. Katie might have simply been a coworker after all. However, as I gave it more thought, I became increasingly aware that something wasn't quite right. I picked me up early from school one afternoon. I chose to surprise Eric at home instead of going out to coffee with a buddy. I suppose I wanted to confront him. I wanted to see him doing it. The fragrance was the first thing I noticed when I entered. It was strange. It's more like scent than a freshly prepared home-cooked dinner. Eric was lying on the bed when I entered our bedroom. He wasn't by himself. With her legs crossed on the bed as though they had been there for hours, Katie was sitting next to him, giggling. I felt my blood begin to boil as my heart fell into my gut. After that, I can't even recall exactly what happened. I believe I simply froze, gazing at them. When he spotted me standing in the doorway, Eric's eyes widened, but I wasn't sure if I was mad at him or at her. Eric stepped in as soon as Katie got to her feet, as if she were about to run. "This isn't what you think, Amanda." I didn't care anymore. Even though his voice was tremulous and his words stumbled out like if he was struggling to think of something to say. All I could do was look at him as my chest constricted, and I felt every bit of treachery strike me like a freight train. "Really?" I fired back. "Eric, what do you suppose this is? What on earth is happening here?" Katie tried to hide from my gaze, looking uneasy. I didn't give a damn about her, but she began mumbling something about having to leave. All I could think of was Eric. "You and she have been skulking around together?" I stepped forward and grew louder as I demanded. "Have you been spending all of your late nights like this?" Slowly, Eric got to his feet and raised his hands in defense. "That isn't the case. We simply..." Before he could finish, I interrupted him. "You're telling lies. You are no different from any other male. Eric, I gave you everything. I looked after you, our family, and our children. You are incapable of being faithful. You've been having affairs with this woman behind my back, and now you're attempting to deceive me into believing it's nothing?" I was now too furious to remain motionless and was pacing the room. Every time he attempted to talk, I simply yelled over him. I became furious the more I said, and I was powerless to stop myself. I needed him to understand how deeply it ached that he had damaged me. I didn't care that Katie had departed at the halfway point of the dispute. Eric was standing there, staring at me, but his eyes were devoid of regret. I have no regrets. I wanted him to plead for pardon. I wanted him to explain that it was an error, and that it had no significance. However, he didn't. Rather, he simply stated, Amanda, I don't think this is working anymore. I felt like I was slapped in the face by those remarks. What? You don't believe it's effective? You want to destroy our entire family because of some affair, even though you've been scheming behind my back? However, his expression was unchangeable. Amanda, he continued softly, I'm not sure what you want from me. This cannot be fixed by me. It's finished. It took a while for the words to sink in. I believe it took me some time to even comprehend his words. We were finished. Then suddenly something inside of me clicked. I was not depressed. I didn't experience heartbreak. I was relieved. I was relieved that I was no longer required to act fake. I felt relieved that I wasn't bearing the entire burden. On the other hand, I was furious. I'm angry at him for pushing me to this point and making me feel inferior in my own fucking marriage. I also ought to have realized how much I had been harming him. I ought to have noticed the fissures before they became a chasm. However, I didn't. And now I was to blame for my family's disintegration. I was now paying for pushing him away and making the jokes. I heard Mia sobbing in the other room as Eric packed up his belongings and departed. Everything I had been avoiding seemed to come at me at once. I was losing more than just my marriage. My family was disappearing. The months that followed were a blur. Court documents, conversations with attorneys, and attempting to determine how to inform Mia and Ethan that their father would not be returning home were all involved. To put it mildly, it was a mess. However, I continued to blame Eric. I convinced myself that I was merely a victim in this situation, that he was the one who messed things up and I had done everything I could. But I knew the truth in my heart. I was involved in this. He had been pushed away by me. I hadn't noticed what was passing through my fingers until it was too late because I had been so preoccupied with my own frustrations and fears. And here I am now, a life I never imagined, alone, and with 2 children to care for. I'm not sure if I'll ever regret how things turned out, but I do know one thing. It might have been different, and I would have acted differently if I could go back in time. However, I am unable to. At this point, my only option is to try to pick myself up and move on. The divorce was ultimately finalized. Eric's wish was granted. He left with a fresh start, no conditions attached, and a blank slate. He could do as he pleased with his life. And me? I had to pick up the pieces of a broken life, a broken family, and a reality I never thought I would have to face. I recall sitting across from Eric at the last court session, with my lawyer next to me and his next to him. Thank God the children weren't present. They didn't have to witness their parents arguing about who should get what in the settlement or the house. The last thing they needed was that. Throughout the process, Eric didn't even glance at me. He appeared composed and unflappable, as if this were all routine business. Perhaps it was. Perhaps the fact that he had already checked out so long ago made it simpler for him to go on. However, it was different for me. Even though I had helped to ruin the family we had created, I wasn't prepared to let it go. For security and the sake of the children, I had remained in that marriage for years. Now it seemed as though all of that had been in vain. It wasn't until I had nothing left that I realized how much I had taken for granted. I was the one who held everything together, the stay-at-home wife. However, I now had to face the consequences of my own decisions. I hadn't been aware of the rifts that were beginning to appear in our marriage. I had let everything to slip away because I was too preoccupied with myself and too enmeshed in my own annoyances and fears. I lost the man I believed I could rely on as a result. I also lost my family, which is more significant. The worst thing, the only one I could blame was myself. Like most men, Eric moved on swiftly. He made a new acquaintance. Someone who was unfamiliar with the man I once loved. Someone who was able to see him without all the baggage I had used to hold him back. And even though I didn't want to accept it, I harbored a tiny grudge against her for that. I detested myself more than anything else, though. I detested the fact that I had let everything to fall apart, and that I had allowed my rage and frustration to fester until it was too late to make any changes. I was left to rebuild my life on my own. Of course, there were moments of weakness, when I reflected on what may have been and questioned whether reconciliation was possible. But I knew in my heart that there wasn't. The damage was already done. Eric was no longer there. And all I had left were the lessons I had discovered the hard way. I had been the type of woman who attributed her troubles to other people, but I never wanted to be that way. I had never given any thought to my own part in the situation we were in because I had been so preoccupied with assigning blame and playing the victim. And I now realized the significance of that as I sat in my home's silence, where the only sounds are my children's distant talk and the odd hum of the refrigerator. Life would never be the same again. Even though I would never be able to regain what I had lost, I was certain of one thing. I would never again take my husband, my family, or my decisions for granted. As a result, I'm attempting to improve myself and my children's lives while figuring out how to be a single mother. However, it's challenging. Additionally, there are days when I think I'll never get it right. Perhaps that's the point, though. Perhaps the only way I can learn is by making mistakes. And perhaps, just possibly, I'll emerge from it stronger. I'm simply trying to survive for the time being, though, to ensure that my children are not burdened by my faults. Must somehow come to terms with my situation after everything that transpired. And I'm now there. I'm still working everything out. I'm still learning. And before it's too late, I hope that anyone else who encounters a similar circumstance can learn from my mistakes.